service business with parents, students, and the community. I think it's important for us to be empathetic to our students with disabilities at school sites. And I think that it's important for us to really build a good relationship with our families. Oftentimes, a lot of our students with disabilities come in with challenging behaviors. And so it's important to not lose track of the child and focus so much on the maladaptive negative behaviors. In the end of the day, as an assistant principal, we're here to advocate for our students with disabilities.
What I would like a new AP to know first is that students with disabilities are general education students first. Some students with disabilities have what I refer to as value-added services, or they have a special education service, whether that's specially designed academic instruction, a related service such as speech and language, or some other type of service. They are primarily general education students first. I would like them to know that all decisions, all communications should be student-centered, regardless of the adult requests. We have to consider what our parents, our community members, guardians want for our students. However, at the end of the day, we are the professionals, and we as professionals have to make the recommendations that are based on student needs. What I'd also like them to know is a very clear understanding of least restrictive environment, or what we refer to as LRE. The education code states that to the maximum extent possible, students with disabilities shall be educated in the general education classroom with their regular education peers. And only if we cannot modify the general education curriculum do we provide anything different or anything separate. We are very quick sometimes to move students from general education or out of the general education program into separate settings, including separate classes on our campuses, separate schools in our districts, and even often non-public schools. And that results in placing many students on a trajectory where they do not earn a high school diploma. So least restrictive environment is very important to consider when determining a student's program.
I think the first thing regarding students with disabilities, they are general education students first. They happen to receive services. At times it happens in a special education setting. Other times it's in the general education setting. So when we are responding to whatever is coming into that front office, recall that they are general education students first, and also recall that you have received this training, and you do know these students, that they're the same students. They might have some added things that are coming with them, but maybe lose some of that fear of IDEA or worried about breaking the IEP, because we can all just deal with a situation one-to-one. The second thing I think that's really important to consider has to do with providing that access. So when we're making decisions, we are helping those students to be able to be with their peers. There's nothing more rewarding than belonging, and that is an essential core thing that every human being needs, that sense of belonging. And if we can help all students, including special ed students, to belong, then you have a more cohesive campus. And wherever we can have that happen, I think it is always the better outcome. And I think the last thing I would think about has to do with students who have disabilities probably had to go through failure to be identified as such. And not just the student, but the families. Tried interventions, tried talking to teachers, maybe got mad at a teacher or two, maybe got mad at a principal or two. You're not doing what you're supposed to be doing. What do you mean it's my son or daughter? So there's been some probably wall that may have gone up at some point in their life, or at some point where they felt school systems didn't work for them. And they're bringing that with them to you. Sweetwater as a secondary district, unfortunately, most of these students are identified prior to them coming to us. And I've heard it said once before where Sweetwater is almost like the second husband gets blamed for all the things the first husband did.
Mm-hmm.
And so knowing that about the students and the families, they come to us with these histories, and being mindful of the backstory that each one might have had. So even if they are emoting to something that's happening, there might be something that had happened in the past. So just helping explain our process and why we're doing what we're doing, and opening up that conversation for whatever the situation is.
I think assistant principals need to start with educating themselves about the student with the IEP and the needs. It's very difficult for assistant principals to work in silos, to work, individually. I think that they need to work with the special education team, with the case carrier, the school psychologist, and any other specialist that works with a student who has an IEP. Starting with educating themselves and informing themselves of the student and their needs and even their strengths. I think it's important that students, their case carriers, the psychologist, and the assistant principal meet almost on a weekly basis should there be an issue with the student.
I think most importantly, supporting students, teachers who have special education credentials. It's way more than just writing an IEP. There are follow-up on progress that we're doing constantly, communication with parent as things might be going on in the home, or things might be going well in math class but they're going bad in English and history and science class, and then also supporting that student, supporting the general education teacher, and helping them not just with accommodations but also being able to help them problem solve. Because, again, students come with their own set of history, and it's difficult to always know what to do in a situation. I think also preparing each one of these individuals, we're almost like an emotional coach at times too as a special education teacher. You need to guide them through a process and reassuring that we're going to be working on it together. And in that constant state of problem solving for each one of the students on that caseload. In addition, you are prepping for classes. As a special education teacher, typically you have more than one prep, of which you probably don't have the general ed credential, and therefore you might not have as much of an expertise or background in that area. However, we get to be pretty darn good at those curricular areas. And all of this has to be done every day, day in, day out. So it's a pretty heavy load as a special education teacher. And having an understanding about that when perhaps maybe something's happening with a parent and they weren't able to respond in a timely manner, having an understanding when you can approach them so that they can not feel threatened, because it's a tough job.
So first, I would want an AP to know to not be afraid to ask questions. We all as professionals are learning every day, and we need to feel comfortable and confident that we can ask questions and that we're here together to work as a team to make the best decisions we can for our students, for all of our students. I would want assistant principals to know 5 definitions for special education. What is special education? What is a related service to support special education or specially designed instruction? And in California, we refer to that as specialized academic instruction. What are supplementary aids and services, those services that support the general education environment? And what are accommodations and modifications, and how do those differ? Those 5 definitions will help an AP tremendously through the IEP process. And then connecting the dots. There are 5 basic dots that we need to connect in special education. And it all starts with assessment. Everything begins with a good assessment, a valid assessment when initiating or substantially changing any type of special education service. From the assessment, we move to what are the present levels of education? What are those areas of need that have been identified? What are the goals? What would that least restrictive environment placement look like? And then what supports would we have for general and special education? So back to those supplementary aids and services and those related services. So through that IEP process, it is a system of connecting all of those dots. And when those dots don't connect, then ask questions and try to seek understanding and making sure that we have those dots connected. And then finally, communicate in a manner that your grandmother can understand. Avoid using jargon and acronyms. We're not lawyers. We are not here to recite the law. We have lawyers to do that. We are here to work and develop and fostering relationships. If we focus on fostering those relationships, that goes a long way in supporting our students with disabilities.
It's not necessarily a concern, but I do know that our classified staff are the hardest working individuals at a school site. They're the least paid, but they're the most hardest worked at our school sites. They deal with students with mild disabilities all the way to severe disabilities, from hygiene to feeding to cleaning out G-tubes. What our classified employees need from us is continued training, support, and also, just that empathic ear from us, from administration. I think assistant principals just need to be aware that our classified employees are the hardest working employees in a school site. I've done that job. I know how difficult it is. It's the lowest paying job here in the district. So I think just a lot of verbal praise and a lot of attaboys or attagirls will go a long way with our classified employees. The other group of classified employees that really need our support are instructional assistants that are in general education classes. We ask a lot of them to work with anywhere between 5 to 10 students with disabilities in general education classes, but yet we don't provide enough support for them in those specific areas and in those specific subject matters. So I think those aides in our co-lab, co-teach classes really need a lot of support from the school sites and from the administrations, so that they can become specialists in their areas of specialty or in their areas of interest.
Trainings are great, and I think training is one part of it, but I almost think a more important part of it is being able to kind of problem solve with your team, with your healthcare, with your instructional assistant. And so time, I think, is probably one of the major concerns I have. I think another concern I would have is at times there are healthcare or instructional assistants who might not have as much of an awareness about the student's disability. And they might try to intervene with something with the best of intentions. And sometimes things go awry. I wouldn't want for them to put themselves in jeopardy or nor their job in jeopardy. I think in the past there may have been a couple of incidents that had happened, but if they had been able to have adequate background or support of somebody or access to that support in that instance, then it may have been easier. I think that goes back to time, though, honestly. Time is the number one thing, I think.
So there are a few specific areas. Our staff in Sweetwater are excellent classified staff who provide direct services to one or more students, as well as support our classroom teachers and other special education staff. An area of opportunity that would be continued training, being prepared to do the job and being open to ongoing learning opportunities. Having flexibility, because we know as teachers, at any given day may change. Students may not come to school, or their needs may change at any given moment, and so being able to have that flexibility within the moment. And having the skills and tools necessary, and if not, then not be afraid to ask. Again, we're a collaborative team. It's not the teacher by themselves, it's the whole team at the school level site that supports our students with disabilities.
In the Sweetwater Union High School District, we tend to get a lot of work dropped on our laps because we're specialists in certain areas. And I was a school psychologist for 10 years, and I was an assistant principal for 3 years. And as an assistant principal, I remember being given a lot of work when it came to our students with disabilities since I had IEPs. And so for any discipline issue, for anything that came up that dealt with a student who had an IEP, that student would be brought to my office so I could deal with them. In regards to the division of labor, I think that we're in a position to where every individual administrator, counselor, school psychologist brings their own specialty when it comes to student needs. I believe that an assistant principal needs to be the administrator that's in charge of student discipline, that's in charge of meeting the students' needs when it comes to classroom or outside of the classroom behaviors. In regards to the counselor, the counselor is there to really take a look at the schedule and make sure that the student's in appropriate classes. But they're also there to provide that counseling support that, as a counselor, we all came into the field for, and that was to support students and their social and emotional needs. And then the school psychologist is there to make sure that the IEP is implemented, that we assess students' needs. And sometimes, and it's probably because of the title, school psychologists tend to be seen as the Superman or the Superwoman of the school site. And so we expect them to have all the answers to any student needs. Going back to the division of labor, I think that the team needs to come together. We need to communicate with one another, and we really need to define the roles as to who is responsible for what.
I think assistant principals, along with psychologists, should be able to do some decision making in terms of a flow, so that students who have a disability that happen to get called into the office do not make a direct line for the psychologist office. There should be one door of services that all of our students walk through. General education is what our students with disabilities participate in first and foremost. They happen to receive services, therefore they all walk through that same door to access whether it's discipline, whether it's counseling, emotional support, and just like any general education student would end up going to the AP or a counselor first, that should still be the case. There certainly are students where I think a psychologist can offer insight for a student, but in the moment, I think it's important to allow these students to access the same set of rules, or what's the word I'm looking for? Just to access it the same way that all their peers do. They need to feel a part of the same school as their peers. When we send them someplace else, that means you don't belong here. I don't deal with you. And that's not what we really want to communicate. And I'm positive that's not what an AP or a counselor is thinking they want to communicate. It's just, oh, I'm not sure about this student. Maybe there's something particular about them. We need to send them to a psychologist. Or we've always sent them to a psychologist, so let's send them to the psychologist. Nobody's probably been able to sit down to go through that whole flow of when and at what point in a conversation. But I definitely think the change should be all students go first and foremost to their APs and counselors, just like their peers.
First, we need to shift our thinking from special education as a place where we send our students to, rather to a service that can be provided in a variety of educational settings, including general education. And it goes back to that least restrictive environment and only removing students from general education if we cannot provide the supports and services that they require. Students with disabilities, again, are general education first. Therefore, all three play a very important role in supporting students with disabilities. The respective job description for each tells us what the division of labor should be. However, it's only when all three of them come to work collaboratively that we see students with disabilities supported in an equitable manner. Students with disabilities are not in special education. Again, some receive specialized services to meet their unique needs. We need to shift our thinking and remember that they are just like any other student, and some have those value-added services. So all three of those individuals play a very important role for our students with disabilities.
And something that I'd like to share with a new assistant principal in regards to special education, just as an assistant principal, it's a beautiful journey. I had the pleasure of being an assistant principal at Southwest High School, and just being able to deal with parents, to deal with students, teachers, and kind of being part of that team that problem solves, something very special and unique. I think I need to just remind people that we are in the customer service field. And regardless of how we feel at the end of the day, whether we're upset, whether we're angry, whether we're sad, we need to have a strong resilience to put away those feelings and start all over again the next day. What I would recommend is that assistant principals have the coping mechanisms in place, or just have someone to talk to get those feelings out, because the next day there's going to be another student that's going to need our support. In regards to students with disabilities, we need to not lose track of who these students are. These students do not choose to misbehave. They don't choose to be inattentive. They don't choose to be hyper or impulsive. That's just part of their neurological processing. It's really something that's wrong with the way they process information. And so I think we need to still continue being empathetic towards that and really not give up on our students.
I would like to comment on how an AP might be able to support a general education teacher with regards to having a student with a 504 or also a student with a disability in their class. It can be overwhelming sometimes for a general education teacher not feeling equipped perhaps at times, or just having too much going on. So instead of always pointing the direction to special ed, the AP being able to help problem solve, just like we would with any other general education student first. What have we tried? Let's go through all this interventions we have available to us. What have we tried? What's worked? What hasn't worked? Have you talked to other gen ed teachers that the student has had success with them? And then also sometimes parents, when they come in, they're going to call and they're going to complain because they know one side. And it might not even be the true side, because there's what the student told the parent, there's what happened in the classroom, and then there's probably what the teacher perceived the student to have done, right? So when you're approaching a parent complaint, have an understanding that the teacher is coming from the perspective of an IEP driven decision making process and use inquiry to help ask them how, perhaps, or what led to, or I'm wondering about, as opposed to why did you? Because typically there is reasoning behind it, and certainly there's things that go wrong in a classroom, and we can be accountable for that, but helping to approach a parent with a concern that we need to work as a team. And all of these questions and concerns can be resolved if we just sit together and get on the same page. I think that would be helpful. Thank you.
Yes, I would like to share with our APs that they and their principals are the instructional leaders on the campus for all teachers, including special education teachers. Our special education teachers and staff need the AP and the schools and not school psychologists, the principal and school psychologists to be those instructional leaders for them. And again, they don't need to know all of the answers. We don't know all of the answers, even though we've been in special education for many, many years. We have teams and we work collaboratively, and we can go to each other to seek the assistance that we may need. Also, I need to remind people that we should be using people first language when we talk about students with disabilities. So it's not that the disability defines the student or the person. It's that they may have a disability, and some students with disabilities and adults require specialized services to support them. And finally, again, I can't stress enough that we need to make sure that all of our decisions are child or student centered, because we're going to be in situations that are very challenging, may be stressful, may have lawyers or advocates or others involved, and can often become confusing. And we need to know that it's okay, that we pause, we take a moment, we regroup, we caucus, we postpone, and not make decisions or recommendations that are not in the best interest of students.